Welcome to Build 2017. I'm Mike Amerlon, Product Marketing Manager on the Office Ecosystem team. And today, we're going to talk about how you can build process solutions for your organization using webhooks inside of SharePoint. Now, to back up, within SharePoint, there are so many things that you can build inside of it. You can, of course, extend your intranet or your digital workplace by customizing the portal, by changing the Chrome, the styling, by adding web parts which allow you to have targeted functionality for your team, your division, your entire organization. In addition, within SharePoint, you can build custom business applications, things like even lightweight CRM applications or inventory trackers or processes that you have a lot of user experiences around. You can build integrations and tools, so things that exist within your company that you want to integrate into the main experience of SharePoint and have jump-off points to, as well as tools for migrating content, for doing various tasks that you might want to use to administer the process of SharePoint. But today we're going to talk about one of the most major things that developers do on top of SharePoint, which is to customize and build document processes and workflows. Now, a lot of companies, as you know, have just lots of content inside of SharePoint. Their documents, their Excel spreadsheets, PowerPoint presentations. A lot of it is really hosted within SharePoint document libraries, and so frequently companies want to tailor that. They want to make sure that they've got the right approval processes, that they are having the right notifications that get sent when important documents like a procedure get updated. So a lot of document gets stored inside of SharePoint, and customers frequently build processes on top of that. And so today what we're going to talk about is how you can leverage things in the developer landscape to build and customize those processes. Now, when we look at the SharePoint developer landscape all up, we start with the data and APIs that are available to developers. These are Graph APIs, Client Object Model, known as CSOM, that's available in both .NET and JavaScript forms, as well as REST APIs. Now, what we're going to talk about is the layer that sits above that, the logic and processing layer. And there's a number of tools here like Flow, like remote event receivers, and webhooks that we'll talk about through this presentation. If you're going to build a user experience, there's tools such as Power Apps and SharePoint Framework and add-ins that complement that underlying logic in those APIs that you have that you're working with. And then finally, there's mechanisms for packaging and deploying all of these customizations into SharePoint through JavaScript on CDNs or through packages that you'll want to use for your solutions. But again, we're going to focus on how we can build modern processes using those logic and processing developer tools available to us. Now, one of the first most fundamental tools is Flow. Now, Flow is a tool for end-user developers, for power users, to start to create actions on top of the content that they have in document libraries. So for example, if you just simply want to have an approval process every time a document changes, you can, through some simple logic, you can add rules in a visual designer through Flow on top of the documents that sit inside of your document library. Now, Flow also has developer extensibility, so if you want to build your own custom services, you can integrate that into Flow as well. And then you can kick off a process, have it do some actions that maybe send out an email and work with SharePoint and work with services outside of Office 365, but then also call into your custom logic as well. Now, of course, within SharePoint, we have a number of third-party options for doing workflow in addition. So definitely, it's very key to taking a view of the entire landscape of solutions for workflow opportunities inside of SharePoint. But starting with Flow, especially if you're a power user, is a great first choice, and developers can extend it with custom services. And then next up, we have remote event receivers and webhooks. Both of these technologies allow you to get a little bit deeper into SharePoint and integrate more closely with changes that happen to documents as they go on, as they change inside of SharePoint. And so this is what we're really going to focus on, how you can add your code right into the process of when documents and content changes inside of SharePoint. So webhooks are a new introduction for SharePoint. We actually had a general availability of them in February. And so what they are is a web standard way to register for changes that should happen to document and content, whether it's in a list, whether it's in a library inside of SharePoint. Now, they're web standard, so they should work fairly familiarly across different applications you've already developed for. So for example, if you're doing payments through Stripe, or if you're doing a number of different other types of services, you'll find these similar types of concepts manifested through webhooks. And in SharePoint, we've tried really hard to make sure that webhooks feel very familiar for developers who've been building webhooks before. Webhooks also feature a very simple registration protocol. You just make a REST call to a web service. There's a simple validation process we'll talk about. And after that, if everything goes great, then your custom web services will start to receive changes from SharePoint every time content in a library should happen to get updated. And finally, they're also designed for robustness, meaning that we want to make sure that even if there's a network outage, even if, for example, your service may be down or SharePoint may have some connectivity issue, that your webhooks that you build can be robust and handle changes in the system and be resilient to those kinds of disruptions. So webhooks are designed with this philosophy that we'll talk about how they can, again, help you handle the exceptions that always happen when, two services are working together. Now, in this initial offering, we focused on providing webhooks for lists and list items. These underline, documents and the lists that you'll see inside of SharePoint, so it's really the core data. But over time, we'll expand the webhooks concept to cover other things like sites and site collections. Now, there's two kinds of webhooks in Office 365 writ large. There's webhooks that are exposed in Microsoft Graph, for doing things like working with OneDrive and files and all of the other kinds of content that you might see inside of Microsoft Graph. And so we're expanding the set of webhooks that are available there. And then there's webhooks that are exposed specifically from SharePoint for things like lists and files. We're going to deal with the latter today, but all the techniques that you'll see also apply to Microsoft Graph. It's really the exact same registration flow. A little bit of some changes just in the JSON payload that you use to register, but otherwise it's really the exact same kinds of concepts. And so with the knowledge that you'll gain here about webhooks, you can actually track and change a lot of different concepts across Office 365. Okay, so let's talk about the webhook registration flow. This is the initial thing that you're going to want to do to register that your service is ready to accept these change request updates that will come from SharePoint in Office 365. It starts with a registering client, typically your website, and the application that's on your website will say, you know what, I want to go register for whenever changes happen inside of this document library. So you'll make an outbound REST-based call to SharePoint. Now, then SharePoint's going to say, great, you are trying to register this web service on contoso.com. I'm going to go check with contoso.com and make sure that that web service is alive, it's awake, and it's able to actually handle this type of call. Now, to validate that, your webhook handler, the web service that gets called during this registration process, will be handed a client state. Now, this is the client state that you initially provided in step 1 when the client was registered. So that allows you to check to make sure that the people that are registering and signing up your web services to notifications are from you, because you'll have a unique client state. Now, if everything is OK, then your web service simply returns a 200, a OK, and that will then connect your web service to changes that happen inside of SharePoint. So a really simple registration flow that we'll take you through. OK, so let's take a look in more detail about this entire process of creating and working with the SharePoint webhook. So in my case, what I have is a document library. So over here, we have a document library with a set of safety guidelines, procedures that are important for maybe a pharmacy or for a doctor's office to make sure that they can give to their patients. And they want to make sure that if there's any changes to these procedures, the right notifications happen to make sure that the customers stay informed. So we want to make sure that there's a change tracking on this document library and that the right emails get sent out. So to do this, the first thing we want to do is connect an Azure function that we've built up into SharePoint so that it receives change notifications. Now, to do that, in the case of this demo, I'm using a tool called Postman. Now, Postman is a tool that's available. It's a third-party tool. It's open. And what you can do with it is basically structure and handcraft your own HTTP web requests. As I mentioned, if this was a full end-to-end demo, I'd probably have my full doctor-patient website. And that would be one of the things that my full doctor-patient website does as it interoperates with SharePoint. In this case, we're just going to handcraft our registration request. Now, one of the great things about Postman is that I can instantly set it up so that I can get an OAuth 2 token. Now, that OAuth 2 token is what allows me to make that authenticated request to SharePoint and has within it my application registration that gives me the permissions to do so. So before we even make this request, we're going to want to go into Azure Active Directory, set up an application registration, grant that application permissions to modify items in my site collections, and then I'm going to want to use this Get New Access token to go ahead and make that request. It will ask me to sign into Office 365. I'll go ahead and do that, and I'll be done. Now, once you've got an OAuth token, you can append that to your header. So you'll see that there's this authorization header in my outbound web request that I'm going to make, and it's got this bearer token which has all of the OAuth token details inside of it. The other headers basically say that I'm going to be making an outbound JSON request to SharePoint. Now in the body of my request, you can see that what I'm essentially doing is registering this, this existing list here. So it's this list with this identifier. That's that list of documents that we were just looking at. You can see that there's a notification URL at mikeamfunctions.azurewebsites.net, which has the actual code for my web service. And I'm also specifying a client state, which is kind of like my secret that I'm going to use to validate that this is the registration request that I initiated, as well as an expiration date time. So your registrations can live for as long as 6 months, so you're going to want to refresh them over time if you need that type of long-lived registration between your web service and SharePoint. So I make this outbound request. Let's go back and let me show you the Azure function that we've got working here. So this is my Azure function. If you're not familiar with Azure functions, they're really great for letting you add just a little bit of code that runs on demand. You don't have a long-running server in the background that's actually hosting your code. And you can embed C# code or other different types of coding libraries and languages straight in line. And so in this case, I'm using C#. Now, what this code does is it will handle my validation request. And if there's an incoming validation request from SharePoint, you'll notice that there's this presence of a validation token. And so what I'll do is I'll validate that token and just return a simple OK response back to SharePoint to let them know that it's OK to register this service. So if I go ahead and just send this request over to SharePoint, what you should see, oh, the token's expired. Oh, I would need to go register for it and go sign into Office 365 with a new OAuth token. That registration would go out, and then it would get connected. And then I would see that the validation code would come here, and it would return an HTTP OK status request. Now, I already have an example of this that has been registered. And so as I actually go into my document library here, and as I go and update this document, for example, take-home best practices, let me go open that in Word Online. What I can do is I can sort of update some of the content. So take-home best practices, read the instructions carefully, like this. It's actually going to be saving those changes back over into my document library. The document library, which has this webhook registered, will then go ahead and call my web service to let them know that the web service has been updated, that the document has been updated, excuse me. OK, so let's go back to our Azure portal. Now these changes are batched up over time, so you may see that they're not going to immediately come in, but they will come in over time in response to as the changes happen in SharePoint. They're just going to be a little bit delayed. But let's take a look at the code. So if I actually scroll down through the code, what you can see is what I'll do is I'll grab the incoming content. What I want to do is actually send out a notification email to my contacts for this particular user. So I'm going to set up an SMTP client, and then I'm going to call into Microsoft Graph. I'm going to grab a list of contacts. I'm going to go parse that JSON response, and then what will happen is it will go and use that list of contacts to go send out an outbound mail message with some updated information that stems from those requests. Now, this really isn't the best possible way to write this Azure function. I'm doing it here for a little bit of simplicity. The reason is because this will fire fairly frequently every time I touch a document inside of SharePoint, and you don't want to send an email every time a set of changes happens inside of SharePoint. And so for that reason, you'll want to, for example, do something a little bit more sophisticated, put a queue behind this, make sure that you sort of notify and send a message somewhere else, and then you've got a separate process that maybe will kick off an email over some time intervals to make sure that the changes are essentially batched. But for the sake of simplicity here, this is what I'm sort of looking for. And so when I actually go over into my inbox over here, what you'll see is there are a set of messages that come because as I've been updating, you'll see that it sent this outbound message with some information around my take-home procedures. And so you'll see notifications come in. Those will go out, and your inbox will get updated as those changes flow throughout the system. So that's just a little bit of an overview of using Azure functions to implement a webhook and a little bit of the registration process of how I actually connected those two things together. Okay, so we talked about webhooks, and webhooks are what's new. They're fairly simple, they're fairly straightforward, but we also have another technology called remote event receivers. Remote event receivers, they work in on-premises SharePoint as well as SharePoint Online. They're introduced with SharePoint 2013. What they allow you to do is a very similar type of concept where you're actually registering a web service that will handle changes that happen inside of SharePoint. Now, what remote event receivers do is they can actually register for before actions in addition to actions that happen after the fact. And so, in addition to getting a notification after a document is changed, you actually have this opportunity to inject logic as a document is updating and before that update gets committed to SharePoint. Now, of course, this means that you need to be very quick in your web service and be very responsive and also tolerant of what happens if your web service isn't able to respond to that request. There is a little bit more broader coverage today for things like site events and list schema events as well through remote event receivers. Now, remote event receivers are tied with the add-in model, which is great if you've got an existing add-in that you want to add some change notification logic to for your process. But if you just want to do a simple process and you just want to do some monitoring, it can take a little bit of work to create an add-in that specifically hosts your remote event receiver. Now, webhooks, on the other hand, I think they're simpler to build. They're consistent with how you might use webhooks in other systems. The other thing about them is that they're designed for robustness. So there's this retry logic. They'll fire over and again if your web service doesn't respond. And in addition, they're designed for robustness because they won't actually give you all of the data about what's changed. They'll just give you a change token. You then call into SharePoint and then go retrieve the exact set of changes. Now, that sounds a little bit more difficult, but the benefit is that your webhook will be a lot more robust because it can handle and deal with the web services more flexibly. Okay, so talking a little bit about roadmap for webhooks and event receivers, we really view these as the foundation for how developers should build business processes in addition to flow and in addition to all of the workflow capabilities that exist. So we expect to expand both flow and logic apps and their presence inside of SharePoint, but we also expect to have more webhooks integration across SharePoint. So for example, things like list metadata and sites. And so you'll be able to take all of the skills that we talked about today and just apply them more broadly to other types of scenarios, like for example, when a site gets created. And so that's what we're looking towards in our roadmap. In addition, we're also looking to do more integration with webhooks across Graph as well, so that you have a more consistent experience for accessing webhooks in addition. So with that, if you want to get started with webhooks, go to akams/SP webhooks start. And you'll find all the getting started documentation to walk you through the process of building your first webhook and building your first developer-driven process on top of SharePoint. Thank you so much for attending, and have a great Build 2017. Thanks.